So for the longest time, I thought that I wouldn't need to read Psychological Types by C.G. Jung because I thought it was all covered by the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. I was wrong. Among other things, in the back of this book, there are about 200 pages. Actually, I think it's 140 pages of definitions which are critical to understanding the work of Dr. C.G. Jung. So today I'm going to read the definition of symbol as Dr. Jung expressed it in Psychological Types, which was published, let's see. Well, I'm not sure exactly when it was published because I'm not getting the right answer here. Let's see. Okay, the first forward in Psychological Types is dated spring 1920. So, the definition of symbol, paragraph 814. Symbol. The concept of symbol should, in my view, be strictly distinguished from that of a sign. Symbolic and semiotic meanings are entirely different things. In his book on symbolism, Ferraro does not speak of symbols in the strict sense, but of signs. For instance, the old custom of handing over a piece of turf at the sale of a plot of land might be described as symbolic in the vulgar sense of the word, but actually it is purely semiotic in character. The piece of turf is a sign or token standing for the whole estate. The winged wheel worn by railway officials is not a symbol of the railway, but a sign that distinguishes the personnel of the railway system. A symbol always presupposes that the chosen expression is the best possible description or formulation of a relatively unknown fact, which is nonetheless known to exist or is postulated as existing. Thus, when the badge of a railway official is explained as a symbol, it amounts to saying that this man has something to do with an unknown system that cannot be differently or better expressed than by a winged wheel. Okay, I'm doing a reading today, so if you have questions about the work of C.G. Jung or anything that I'm reading, this is a behind-the-scenes unedited video, so you're welcome to ask. I'll stop every 5 to 10 minutes to check for questions. Every view which paragraph 815. Every view which interprets the symbolic expression as an analog or an abbreviated designation for a known thing is semiotic. A view which interprets the symbolic expression as the best possible formulation of a relatively unknown thing, which for that reason cannot be more clearly or characteristically represented, is symbolic. A view which interprets the symbolic expression as an intentional paraphrase or transmogrification of a known thing is allegoric. The interpretation of the cross as a symbol of divine love is semiotic because divine love describes the fact to be expressed better and more aptly than a cross, which can have many other meanings. On the other hand, an interpretation of the cross as symbolic, when it puts the cross beyond all conceivable explanations, regarding it as expressing an as yet unknown and incomprehensible fact of a mystical or transcendent, i.e., psychological nature, which simply finds itself most appropriately represented in the cross. Paragraph 816. So long as a symbol is a living thing, it is an expression for something that cannot be characterized in any other or better way. The symbol is alive only so long as it is pregnant with meaning. But once its meaning has been born out of it, once that expression is found which formulates the thing sought, expected, or divined even better than the hitherto accepted symbol, then the symbol is dead, i.e., it possesses only an historical significance. We may still go on speaking of it as a symbol on the tacit assumption that we are speaking of it as it was before the better expression was born out of it. The way in which St. Paul and the earlier speculative mystics speak of the cross shows that for them it was still a living symbol which expressed the inexpressible in unsurpassable form. For every esoteric interpretation, the symbol is dead, because esotericism has already given it, at least ostensibly, a better expression, whereupon it becomes merely a conventional sign of associations that are more completely and better known elsewhere. Only from the exotic standpoint is the symbol a living thing. Paragraph 817. An expression that stands for a known thing remains a mere sign and is never a symbol. It is therefore quite impossible to create a living symbol, i.e., one that is pregnant with meaning, from known associations. For what is thus produced never contains more than what was put into it. For what is thus produced never contains more than was put into it. Every psychic product, if it is the best possible expression at the moment for a fact as yet unknown or only relatively known, may be regarded as a symbol, provided that we accept the expression as standing for something that is only divined and not yet clearly conscious. Since every scientific theory contains an hypothesis and is therefore an anticipatory description of something still essentially unknown, it is a symbol. Furthermore, every psychological expression is a symbol if we assume that it states or signifies something more and other than itself, which eludes our present knowledge. This assumption is absolutely tenable wherever a consciousness exists which is attuned to the deeper meaning of things. It is untenable only when this same consciousness has itself devised an expression which states exactly what it is intended to state, a mathematical term, for instance. But for another consciousness, this limitation does not exist. It can take the mathematical term as a symbol for an It can take the mathematical term as a symbol for an unknown psychic fact, which the term was not intended to express but is concealed within it. A fact which is demonstrably not known to the man who devised the semiotic expression, and which therefore could not have been the object of any conscious use. Today is a behind-the-scenes reading. If you're watching, you're welcome to ask me questions. I will stop every 5 to 10 minutes to see if there are any questions in the chat. And I'm continuing on. Paragraph 818. Whether a thing is a symbol or not depends chiefly on the attitude of the observing consciousness. For instance, on whether it regards a given fact not merely as such, but also as an expression of something unknown. Hence, it is quite possible for a man to establish a fact which does not appear in the least symbolic to himself, but is profoundly so to another consciousness. The converse is also true. There are undoubtedly products whose symbolic character does not depend merely on the attitude of the observing consciousness, but manifests itself spontaneously in the symbolic effect they have on the observer. Such products are so constituted that they would lack any kind of meaning were not a symbolic one conceded to them. Taken as a bare fact, a triangle with an eye enclosed in it is meaningless Taken as a bare fact, a triangle with an eye enclosed in it is so meaningless that it is impossible for the observer to regard it as a merely accidental piece of foolery. Such a figure immediately conjures up a symbolic interpretation. This effect is reinforced by the widespread incidence of the same figure in identical form, or by the particular care that went into its production, which is an expression of the special value placed upon it. Paragraph 819. Symbols that do not work in this way on the observer are either extinct, i.e., have been superseded by a better formulation, or are products whose symbolic nature depends entirely on the attitude of the observing consciousness. The attitude that takes a given phenomenon as symbolic may be called, for short, the symbolic attitude. It is only partially justified by the actual behavior of things. For the rest, it is the outcome of a definite view of the world, which assigns meaning to events, whether great or small, and attaches to this meaning a greater value than to bare facts. This view of things stands opposed to another view, which lays the accent on sheer facts and subordinates meaning to them. For the latter attitude, there can be no symbols whatever when the symbolism depends exclusively on the mode of observation. But even for such an attitude, symbols do exist, those, namely, that prompt the observer to conjecture a hidden meaning. A bull-headed god can certainly be explained as a man's body with a bull's head on it. But this explanation can hardly hold its own against the symbolic explanation, because the symbolism is too arresting to be overlooked. A symbol that forcibly obtrudes its symbolic nature on A symbol that forcibly obtrudes its symbolic nature on us need not be a living symbol. It may have a merely historical or philosophical significance and simply arouses intellectual or aesthetic interest. A symbol really lives only when it is the best and highest expression for something divine, but not yet known to the observer. It then compels his unconscious participation and has a life-giving and life-enhancing effect. As Faust says, how differently this new sign works upon me. And that's from Goethe's Faust, page 22. Paragraph 820. The living symbol formulates an essential unconscious factor, and the more widespread this factor is, the more general is the effect of the symbol, for it touches a corresponding chord in every psyche. Since, for a given epoch, it is the best possible expression for what it is the best possible expression for what is still unknown, it must be the product of the most complex and differentiated minds of that age. But in order to have such an effect at all, it must embrace what is common to a large group of men. This can never be what is most differentiated, the highest attainable, for only a very few attain to that or understand it. The common factor must be something that is still so primitive that its ubiquity cannot be doubted. Only when the symbol embraces that and expresses it in the highest possible form is it of general efficacy. Herein lies the potency of the living social symbol and its redeeming power. Paragraph 821. All that I have said about the social symbol applies equally to the individual symbol. There are individual psychic products whose symbolic character is so obvious that they at once compel a symbolic interpretation. For the individual, they have the same functional significance that the social symbol has for a larger human group. These products never have an exclusively conscious or an exclusively unconscious source, but arise from the equal collaboration of both. Purely unconscious products are no more convincingly symbolic per se than purely conscious ones. It is the symbolic attitude of the observing consciousness that endows them both with the character of a symbol. But they can be conceived equally well as causally determined facts, in much the same way as one might regard the red exanthema of scarlet fever as a symbol of the disease. In that case, it is perfectly correct to speak of a symptom and not of a symbol. In my view, Freud is quite justified when, from his standpoint, he speaks of symptomatic rather than symbolic actions, since for him these phenomena are not symbolic in the sense here defined. Since for him these phenomena are not symbolic in the sense here defined, but are symptomatic signs of a definite and generally known underlying process. There are, of course, neurotics who regard their unconscious products, which are mostly morbid symptoms, as symbols of supreme importance. Generally, however, this is not what happens. On the contrary, the neurotic of today is only too prone to regard a product that may actually be full of significance as a mere symptom. Paragraph 822. The fact that there are two distinct and mutually contradictory views eagerly advocated on either side concerning the meaning or meaninglessness of things shows that processes obviously exist which express no particular meaning, being in fact mere consequences or symptoms, and that there are other processes which bear within them a hidden meaning, processes which are not merely derived from something but which seek to become something and are therefore symbols. It is left to our discretion and our critical judgment to decide whether the thing we are dealing with is a symptom or a symbol. Paragraph 823. The symbol is always a product of an extremely complex nature, since data from every psychic function have gone into its making. It is therefore neither rational nor irrational. It certainly has a side that accords with reason, but it has another side that does not, for it is composed not only of rational but also of irrational data supplied by pure inner and outer perception. The profundity and pregnant significance of the symbol appear just as strongly to thinking as to feeling, while its peculiar plastic imagery, when shaped into sensuous form, stimulates sensation as much as intuition. The living symbol cannot come to birth in a dull or poorly developed mind, for such a mind will be content with the already existing symbols offered by established tradition. Only the passionate yearning of a highly developed mind, for which the traditional symbol is no longer the unified expression of the rational and the irrational, or the highest and the lowest, can create a new symbol. Soul Life says, hi, I have a question. Can fictional characters not live up to their fullest potential, or is it all up to the creator to say what they are? How can we tell what they really represent? Let me think about that one for a moment. Okay. Certainly fictional characters can not live up to their fullest potential. And certainly we see fictional characters over decades now who have developed. We see these in the Star Wars characters, for example, where Luke Skywalker, for example, begins as a young ingenue and becomes a fierce warrior later on. And then he becomes Senex, which is an old man at the end in the various series. So he obviously is changing and reaching his fullest potential, his individuation throughout the series. So certainly if you only took the first movie of the series Star Wars, you wouldn't be seeing Luke Skywalker living up to his fullest potential. Or is it all up to the creator to say what they are? Well, actually no, because when we're talking about fictional characters, the creator presents what it is, what he says it is, he or she says it is, but the fictional character then takes on a life of its own in the psyches of the audience. So we project on that fictional character something about our own lives. And if it is archetypal, and certainly Star Wars is known very widely as an archetypal movie, we all have our own associations. So when I say any word, it will conjure something different in your mind than it does in my mind. For example, I often use the word boat. When I say the word boat, you have no idea what the image of that boat is in my mind. You know what it is in your mind. And so a writer of fiction can present a series of words, but as Dr. Jung says on page 244 of the Red Book, a series of words has more than one meaning. And so, and he also said elsewhere, I think, that words are like wild animals. And so the same is true of characters. And those characters take on a life of their own in each of our psyches. And so the creator can certainly try to specify as much as possible the type of person a character is, but how it is heard by the audience is, up for grabs. It's like the artist who does a painting, and then he goes to the exhibition and is talking to somebody who's looking at his painting, and he says, what do you see in this painting? And the viewer says something entirely different from what the artist was thinking. And so any creator has to be prepared to let go of what they're presenting. I mean, even this video, for example, I have to do my reading and then let go and hope that it achieves a certain purpose that I have in mind, but I have no idea what purpose it will fulfill in the minds of my audience. How can we tell what they really represent? This is where we have to get better at examining ourselves, because what characters really represent are within each member of the audience. And so there's no way that the creator is going to know what they really represent in anybody, and except himself or herself, perhaps. And so, I don't know, I hope that's helpful. That's sort of a off the top of my head response to these questions. These are good questions. Thank you for asking them. Okay, so I'm doing a reading from Psychological Types I'm doing a reading from Psychological Types by C.G. Jung, and I'm reading from the Appendix, which contains the very detailed definitions Dr. Jung made of certain psychological ideas. Today I'm reading the definition of symbol, and I guess we have a ways to go yet. Yep, we have another 3 pages to go in one definition, and we've been at it for half an hour. So anyway, moving right along. I do stop every 5 to 10 minutes in these behind-the-scenes sessions to answer any questions that people have, and so do ask in the chat if you have any thoughts or make any comments you wish to make. Okay. Paragraph 824. But precisely because the new symbol is born of man's highest spiritual aspirations and must at the same time spring from the deepest roots of his being, it cannot be a one-sided product of the most highly differentiated mental functions, but must derive equally from the lowest and most primitive levels of the psyche. For this collaboration of opposing states to be possible at all, they must first face one another in the fullest conscious opposition. This necessarily entails a violent disunion with oneself, to the point where thesis and antithesis negate one another, while the ego is forced to acknowledge its absolute participation in both. If there is a subordination of one part, the symbol will be predominantly the product of the other part, and to that extent less a symbol than a symptom of the suppressed antithesis. To the extent, however, that a symbol is merely a symptom, it also lacks a redeeming effect, since it fails to express the full right of all parts of the psyche to exist, being a constant reminder of the suppressed antithesis, even though consciousness may not take this fact into account. But when there is full parity of the opposites, attested by the ego's absolute participation in both, this necessarily leads to a suspension of the will, for the will can no longer operate when every motive has an equally strong countermotive. Since life cannot tolerate a standstill, a damming up of vital energy results, and this would lead to an insupportable condition and this would lead to an insupportable condition did not the tension of opposites produce a new, uniting function that transcends them. This function arises quite naturally from the regression of libido caused by the blockage. All progress having been rendered temporarily impossible by the total division of the will, the libido streams backwards, as it were, to its source. In other words, the neutralization and inactivity of consciousness bring about an activity of the unconscious, where all the differentiated functions have their common, archaic root, and where all contents exist in a state of promiscuity, of which the primitive mentality still shows numerous vestiges. At the end of this, I'm going to make a comment about how this applies to us now. So, anyway, if you don't want to hear a political comment, then please discontinue listening after I complete the definition. Paragraph 825. From the activity of the unconscious, there now emerges a new content, constellated by thesis and antithesis in equal measure, and standing in a compensatory relation to both. It thus forms the middle ground on which the opposites can be united. If, for instance, we receive the opposition to be sensuality versus spirituality, then the mediatory content born out of the unconscious provides a welcome means of expression for the spiritual thesis because of its rich spiritual associations, and also for the sensual antithesis because of its sensuous imagery. The ego, however, torn between thesis and antithesis, finds in the middle ground its own counterpart. Its sole and unique its sole and unique means of expression, and it eagerly seizes on this in order to be delivered from its division. The energy created by the tension of opposites therefore flows into the mediatory product and protects it from the conflict which immediately breaks out again. For both the opposites are striving to get the new product on their side. Spirituality wants to make something spiritual out of it, and sensuality something sensual. The one wants to turn it into science or art, the other into sensual experience. The appropriation or dissolution of the mediatory product by either side is successful only if the ego is not completely divided but inclines more to one or the other. But if one side succeeds in winning over and dissolving But if one side succeeds in winning over and dissolving the mediatory product, the ego goes along with it, whereupon an identification of the ego with the most favored function ensues. Consequently, the process of division will be repeated later on a higher plane. Paragraph 826. If, however, as a result of the stability of the ego, neither side succeeds in dissolving the mediatory product, this is sufficient demonstration that it is superior to both. The stability of the ego and the superiority of the mediatory product to both thesis and antithesis are, to my mind, correlates, each conditioning the other. Sometimes it seems as though the stability of the inborn individuality were the decisive factor, sometimes as though the mediatory product possessed a superior power that determines the ego's absolute stability. In reality, it may be that the stability of the one and the superior power of the other are two sides of the same coin. If the mediatory product remains intact, it forms the raw material for a process not of dissolution, but of construction, in which thesis and antithesis both play a part. In this way, it becomes a new content that governs the whole attitude, putting an end to the division and forcing the energy of the opposites into a common channel. The standstill is overcome and life can flow on with renewed power towards new goals. Paragraph 828. I have called this process in its totality the transcendent function. Function being here understood not as a basic function, but as a complex function made up of other functions, and transcendent not as denoting a metaphysical quality, but merely the fact that this function facilitates a transition from one attitude to another. The raw material shaped by thesis and antithesis, and in the shaping of which the opposites are united, is the living symbol. Its profundity of meaning is inherent in the raw material itself, the very stuff of the psyche transcending time and dissolution, and its configuration by the opposites ensures its sovereign power over all the psychic functions. Paragraph 829. Indications of the process of symbol formation are to be found in the scanty records of the conflicts experienced by the founders of religion during their initiation period, e.g., for example, the struggle between Jesus and Satan, Buddha and Mara, Luther and the devil, Zwingli and his previous worldly life, or the regeneration of Faust through the pact with the devil. In Zarathustra, we find an excellent example of the suppressed antithesis in Zarathustra. In Zarathustra, we find an excellent example of the suppressed antithesis in the ugliest man. Okay, so that completes that definition. I guess what I would say is that our politics are an excellent example of this, and our country is a symbol of what the results are. And if we take, for example, our red state, blue state dichotomy that we currently are suffering through, the solution to our red state, blue state duality will emerge symbolically. And I can't predict when that solution will occur, but obviously we have a thesis and an antithesis, and something new will emerge from that. And what we can see about the United States in terms of its strength as a country is that it is the result of this kind of synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It is a synthesis of this type of process that has gone on for 400 years. And the result is that we have a relatively stable country, although we have really widely swinging thesis and antithesis going on in our psyches right now. And we can't see we cannot yet see what the synthesis will be, but that may start to emerge at Election Day 2018. And so whatever the synthesis of what's gone on in the last 2 years are in your own psyche, please do go out and vote, because that vote is your piece, your tile in the great mosaic of life, where you are expressing that synthesis in your own psyche. And I guess I would ask that all of us consider where our country will be in 30 years for our grandchildren. Unlikely that I'll get to see that in 30 years, but if I do, I'll be happy. But I know my grandchildren will be living that synthesis of what's happening now. And so I'm hopeful that the unconscious of the country will symbolically throw up an answer for us. That's sort of my observation. Hermit Nick says pendulum politics. I don't think pendulum politics are inevitable. Yes, pendulum politics is very often the case, and what we see is the different sides throwing different issues into one side or the other so that they try to outweigh one another, and what we see is sort of a balancing between the two sides. But the synthesis is the country. If you go out around the United States, in pretty much everywhere, you can travel safely and live wherever you like, and life is relatively good. From certain groups' points of view, things could be much better. I have no doubt about that. But if we look at the reality of our country, pretty much everywhere you go, you will find welcoming people who will be only too happy to take your money for your gasoline or your purchases of your groceries. And things have changed. So if I think of this as I faced it in 1968, 50 years ago, when I graduated from college, things were much, much worse then. And I think young people today don't really understand how much worse they really were. But what we got over the next 50 years after those bad times, when we had four important political leaders attacked, and only George Wallace survived his attack, but Bobby Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. all died. Those were very bad times in our country. But those times caused soul-searching. They caused unconscious changes in the way we live as Americans, and things that were absolutely unthinkable in 1968 are happening all the time today. And in safety and happiness, I'm not saying that everybody is pleased about that, but we have to live the reality of our country, which is it's been created by people from every national group, every race, every religion, every creed, and we have both the terrible ideas and the good ideas, but the result has been a synthesis that is a country that's quite strong and is and can stand up to the challenges that it currently faces. And so, although I know a lot of people are disheartened by what they see in politics today, I feel quite certain that a year from now we will see that we have a better country. And it doesn't mean that everybody in the country will think that. I mean that is the balance that is achieved by our social life. So anyway, that's my thought, and I think the United States is a symbol of that strong synthesis that the United States represents. Obviously, the psyche and any group, any social group, is complicated. And it's complicated on many different parameters. In Jungian psychology, we talk about the opposites all the time, but it isn't the opposites. Obviously, pendulum politics do happen, as long as we let them happen. But ultimately, a result will emerge. And so in the 50 years that I've been carefully watching it, I can say that symbolically we have a much better country than what we had in 1968. And things were looking pretty bad back then. And I'm sure if you're younger than 50 years old, you will also see that things are vastly changed 50 years hence than where they are today. So anyway, I guess that's all I have to say. Some things are easier than others. If we take the symbol of the U.S. Marine Corps, for example, there's no way that a person who served in the U.S. Marine Corps can in any way convey to someone who has not served what it means to be a Marine. And so for a person who has not served, the symbol of the U.S. Marine Corps is only a sign. It's a sign that says this is the U.S. Marine Corps, a service of the national defense of the United States, but not much more. But for a Marine, that symbol is much more significant, and it's more than a sign, because I don't think any of us can express the true meaning of the symbol to us or to our fellow Marines. We know what it means, but a lot of what we know is actually unconscious. And I think that's what Dr. Jung was saying. It's like the symbols of the three Abrahamic religions. If, as a Christian, the cross has a certain depth meaning to me that is inexpressible, but to a non-Christian, it just means there's a Christian church, for example. It's a sign that there's a Christian church there. But to someone who has truly been touched by Jesus Christ, then it has much more depth meaning. And the same would be true of the Star of David. I actually, since I'm not a Jew, I actually have no concept of what the Star of David means to a Jew. I only know that if I see the Star of David, I know that I'll find Jews over there. And the same is true of the crescent moon for Islam. It so happens that, having traveled a lot in the Middle East, I have more of a sense of what the crescent moon may mean to Muslims, but I'm sure I don't have anything like the depth of understanding that a Muslim would have. So anyway, the essence of what Dr. Jung was talking about, though, is this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. When we get two things that are clashing and it doesn't seem like there's any answer, what happens is our psyche, going back to the primordial levels of our psyche, will throw up a symbol of a solution between the two. And I can't say what that may be, but I know that it will be. It will happen. And, in the case of our conflict over civil rights between whites and blacks 50 years ago, I can say that one symbol today is probably the fact that there is a statue of Martin Luther King Jr. on the Mall in Washington. And that statue has huge meaning to tens of millions of Americans. And it is symbolic of the fact that we have somewhat reconciled our races. Not perfectly. We still have a long way to go, but as compared to where we were 50 years ago, it's a great achievement, So anyway, and I think if you go to look at the Vietnam War Memorial, I know for my generation that's extremely meaningful and symbolic, and I just couldn't possibly tell you. I know that on many occasions when I've been there and touched the names of my friends who are which appear on that wall. It has huge meaning to me. So it's not just a memorial of a war that we had 50 years ago. It is for those of us who served at that time, it's a living symbol and very important to us. So anyway, that's deep. And so I think I'll sign off. If anybody has any comment, I'll give you 30 seconds to raise your hand on the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to cut it off for today. And this will be a behind-the-scenes playback on the channel here shortly. So it worked out all right, because I was uploading another video, and which wasn't going through. I was hoping it would go through, but it apparently has done. So I can both broadcast and upload at the same time. So peace. Tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time will be a live session, our usual. This will be our 89th live Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group meeting. And it's an open forum, among other things, so you're welcome to join us. 8 p.m. Eastern U.S. time, Monday. Thank you.